So let's go over how much weight you should use for a bicep curl. This may seem seemingly simple, but this simple thing is performed wrong many, many times because I see it. So the way that we can break this down and to know how much weight you should use for your curl is to isolate the motion and show you where your biceps attach and essentially how we can maximize their workload. And the attachments are important so that you'll know when something is going wrong. So since your bicep attaches from essentially your radial tuberosity here, and then it has two different heads. It's got a short head, it's got a long head that actually crosses your shoulder joint. So your bicep crosses two different joints, your shoulder and your elbow. This means that shoulder and elbow position dictate how the bicep contracts. So we want to maximize the load for your biceps, but the way we're going to do that is by isolating the joint and keeping the joints that we're crossing essentially still to maximize that workload of the bicep. So if you're performing a curl, that means that we want to keep your elbow completely still as it's bending and as your bicep is shortening to here. Once your elbow moves during a curl, then we have two different joint motions going on. We can either isolate elbow flexion by just moving here, making the bicep essentially as isolated as we can, or we can think about taking the dumbbell or the bar as far up towards your shoulder as you can, meanwhile moving the elbow. But once we've moved the elbow, that becomes two different joint motions. It becomes shoulder flexion and elbow flexion. So now all your shoulder flexors are going to help your biceps and essentially offload your biceps during the curl. I think a lot of times when people are doing a bicep curl, they're thinking about how far they can take the dumbbell towards their shoulder, and that's why they move the elbow. Or they just have too much weight. I think a lot of times it's more of a directional thing. It's like I need to take this object all the way to here. And then what happens is they're moving joints they shouldn't be moving. Maybe their elbow's moving and their back. And that's also how injuries happen. So if I have this bar and I'm doing a curl, I'm going to get the most from my bicep by keeping my elbows still and isolating this elbow flexion as I bend my arm here. This is as far as I can go into elbow flexion without moving into shoulder flexion here. But once I've done that, it's no longer my biceps. Now I'm using all my shoulder flexors. So it's better to use either less load or move through a seemingly more shallow, shorter range and isolate that elbow flexion to maximize the work from your bicep. That is how you know how much load to use on a bicep curl. You're going to use as much load as you can, keeping your elbows still, making sure that you're not using your back or going into a completely different joint motion, which is going to be probably the shoulder flexion. The other thing that can go wrong is you can go into shoulder extension. So sometimes people will go essentially back with their elbows as they come up. If I am bending my elbow here and then I'm moving back here, well, I'm even reducing the range even more, and this isn't going to be as much from my bicep either because I've moved the joint and I'm essentially moving this end closer to this end here. You can do a curl and shoulder extension, but you need to isolate the components, essentially perform a curl from neutral, flexion, and then maybe extension as opposed to moving the joint axis during the motion here. The best way to know how much weight to use is to isolate the joints that we're moving and then make sure those joints are staying stationary as you're moving through the range. Elbow flexion being that your elbow isn't moving front to back as you perform that curl.